Welcome back to the program, another disciple making interview, and I'm excited to be talking with Jason Alexander. Jason, welcome. Happy afternoon.
Yeah, wow. I was excited to talk with you, man. Thank you.
Here's some one liners for you then that you might
Okay.
remember from your paper, but I thought they just might lead to an
Okay.
interesting thought trail. From your Living in the Text paper, there's one line you have in here that reads, "Good interpretation is much more than a matter of proper exegesis or getting the
Mm.
text right. It also means having a nuanced doctrine of Scripture and a consistent
Yeah.
hermeneutic." And I wondered if you could expand on that in getting the
Yeah.
text right to have that nuance of doctrine and consistent
Mm.
hermeneutic. How do those work together?
Yeah. That way of thinking about things is, I think, a product of lots of critical readings of the Bible. Um, I think I think the assumption is by especially a lot of people who are excited about study. And man, you're going to be hard pressed to find someone more excited than I am about study of Scripture. I love it. Um, but I think that there's this assumption that if you study long enough and hard enough and know enough, you will kind of crack the code. And you sort of teach the text, you kind of put it in the corner and almost hold it hostage until it yields the kind of clarity you want. And so this creates a situation, in my experience, where where you could call it abuse, but it's at least misuse or misunderstanding of what I think as Christians, what we believe God to be saying. Um, and I had that experience writing this paper, and so that sentence is a great way of describing my experience of writing. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I spent a year with 1 Timothy 2. Everything I could get my hands on that had been written about it or said about it. I wanted to know the ins and outs of everything about this bit of, which some people won't even say it is Paul, but from our vantage point, it's the Apostle Paul. And so, and at the end, I'm reading uh, books about legal innovation in in Deuteronomy, and I'm like, okay, wait a second, like, all right, this is really difficult to nail down. And for every time I think I get a step in the right direction, someone else says something that makes just as much sense to me, and it's from a different vantage point, making a different argument. And so I realized, like, man, you can make the case
Oh, yeah.
in a number of ways, and they're all very convincing. What if perhaps there's something beyond that God is driving at in the church through Scripture to cause us to deal with Him? Who
Yes.
is? I remember I was fortunate to be a part of a little advertisement for my church years ago, and it was like a little video we made where we're like, hey, come to our church, we're diverse. And then someone else got, we love Jesus. But the line I was given to say was, everything we do centers on the Bible. Or no, it was, the Bible is at the center of everything we do. And I said it. And I said it against my better judgment. And I know what's meant, and I understand what's meant. And I actually, to a degree, that's what I believe. Um, and it's funny. I went and looked on our website, and lo and behold, when it says the about section of our church, Jesus never came up. The Bible came up like 4 times. Jesus never came up. And I thought, well, okay, how is it that I think the Bible itself would have a problem with how we're talking about it? Because it's aiming beyond itself to the reality of God, and it's speaking with great authority, on behalf of God in some sense, through human beings. And so I felt like this, while with all the desire to sound faithful, we're actually misunderstanding, I think, some of the point of Scripture. And I want to be careful here, because don't hear me saying we should decenter scripture and like put it off in the corner. Holy cow, that would be a travesty. So if you imagine like Copernicus's model of the solar system, with the sun at the center, which, as I'm told, that's how things are, right? Like the sun at the center and the earth revolves around the planets, orbit the sun. What can happen, especially in churches like ours, I'm sure you've heard this, but it's said outside the churches of Christ about us in the churches of Christ that our Trinity is Father, Son, and Holy Bible. And there's a reason why people on the outside looking in would think that we are people of the book. And in a solar system where if the earth is like the church revolving around the sun, we're in danger of putting scripture as the sun around which the church revolves. And it even sounds good when I describe that. But I think scripture would want us to put the triune God at the center around which the church revolves. But then the question gets asked, okay, well, where does the Bible fit in? And I would almost say, this is where the analogy breaks down, but it's almost like the Bible is the eyeballs of the people who live on planet Earth. The Bible is that thing that allows us to see the center. It's the telescope, however you want. Like without scripture, we won't see the center. There's no viewing the sun. And so I think the challenge is not to make the Bible an idol, which seems to be Jesus's regular interaction with Pharisees, is like, the Bible better than anyone, and the Bible worse than anyone at the same time. How is that possible? And I think it comes from becoming such people of the text that you forget that the text would actually have you do business with the God who is actually among you. He's present. And that's not to say that God
Yeah.
lives apart
Hmm.
from the text and will now act in ways contradictory to the text. But without the text, you might not notice that God. So you can't get rid of your eyeballs or you'll be blind. When we imagine that if we just study more, if we get more teachers involved, or scrap the title teacher, get more evangelists, get more campus ministers, more men, more women, every color, we just study more, we'll get there. I think there's some problems with that, because in my experience, as someone who does love Jesus and is, wants to be a pastor, that's what I'd love to be, thought of someone who shepherds others. That's how I'd like God to think of me. Like I want the text to have meaning for people, but if I'm honest, super critical readings of scripture, which are necessary, will make you painfully aware of the distance historically between you sitting here with this open, codex on your lap and that ancient community to whom these words and from whom these words were written. And it doesn't take long to see there's diversity in ideology, even within scripture. It's not this like clean monolith across from beginning to end. There are discussions even in scripture with scripture having dialogue with other bits of scripture. And the whole thing can make our stress level rise as we're studying, because we're imagining that careful study is going to bring us closer to certainty in some areas. And in fact, what it's doing is inviting us into a dialogue that is pretty ancient, and we're at a remove from it. And so my experience is, like, here's the thing: if I were to go up in front of my church on Sunday and invite the church into that discussion, critical readings of really looking at text and looking at language and looking at history, and like, number one, some of that's going to be conjecture because we're not there. Like, there's not 100% objectivity. We're just going to take the text and we get it. So there's a lot of work that has to go into even walking away feeling good with some answers. And again, this is not on the whole. I'm not saying the Bible is so opaque that no one could understand it. I think it's discernible. I know it is. Like, Jesus is understandable. What it means to follow him is understandable. But then there are these areas that are difficult, like men and women and their participation in the Sunday gathering, where it's almost as if Scripture saying, "Nope, you're going to have to fall to your knees here. You're going to have to study, but studying will only bring you further into the complexity, which will hopefully cause you to learn to, this like the Protestant readings of scripture, sola scriptura. The whole idea was any one bit of scripture has to be read in concert with all of scripture. And so careful study forces us into that. Okay, well, what is Moses really doing, and how is Paul relating? So these are all in-depth things. So it's stressful, honestly.
Stresses us to the point of taking a knee. I appreciate that background. It unpacks it really well. Consistent no, nuanced doctrine and consistent hermeneutic. I think towards the beginning there, you're talking about the caution of overestimating our understanding or saying that we have a final say, because then we could hijack God's final
Right.
say from this text. And that's where there's some truth. If we go to that extreme, I've heard the common accusation from progressive Christianity that biblical authority is an idol for Christians because they replace Jesus with that biblical authority. And maybe that can happen. And certainly, I think people can abuse that
Right.
with, well, my interpretation of this biblical
Right.
authority is what you should submit to. Um, but man, if we include Jesus, hopefully we can avoid some of those extremes. And it sounds like that critical, stressful work. Man, if we're going to do that, we
Yeah.
better be humbled to Jesus. If
Yeah.
we're going to
Yeah.
have a hope of learning there.
Yes. And again, when I say stressful, it's only, let me rephrase that. It's only stressful when it falls into the laps of panicked people in search of certitude. And when we have these kind of expectations and they don't yield, or we think we've arrived at clarity, but it's someone else who loves Jesus is sitting across from us saying, I see something else here. So this critical reading, uh, its work in the church could be, or could open up the possibility of humility and learning the other and learning how to be faithful. But yeah, you're right. This discussion should not move us to some kind of overly progressive, like, well, the authority of the Bible is subjective. Like, come on, that's absolute insanity. That we would move from Scripture doesn't tell me what I want to know, or faithful people disagree about Scripture, therefore Scripture's authority is compromised. Um, that's a shame. Having said that, I talk about this a lot with all different kinds of congregations. Sometimes what we imagine to be faithful readings can be nothing more than anxiety, having a grip on a text and not being willing to open it. And my favorite
Hmm.
story in Scripture that highlights this is Jesus' interaction, Mark 12, with the Sadducees, where they're questioning him about resurrection, and they're like, well, if there's a resurrection, then a woman marries a husband, and he dies, and the brother marries him, and the brother marries him, and whose wife is she at the end? All the brothers died, and no one had any kids, and Jesus is like, so you
Yeah.
mean to tell me you actually think the God who promises blessing and land and rest to Abraham, you think that story ends in death? That's your takeaway. And it's like, yeah, but Scripture says. And it's like, wait a second. You think that Scripture ends in death, that death has the final word. And so for all of these nuanced, careful readings of law, it's like they missed the larger um, image of God set forth. And I think sometimes when we're so close to texts and doctrines, we hold them so dear that I think there'll come times, and it's uncomfortable, when God tries to pluck our little fingers off things and open us up, and that is really uncomfortable, personally and corporately. I think that's difficult, and that's why I say you cannot be panicked, you cannot be immature if you're going to have these discussions. You must be faithful and patient.
I've been in Ephesians 3, and early on, well, it brings up
Right,
mystery
right.
like 4 times in there. And at one point, it's the
Yeah.
unsearchable riches of Christ. And then later on, it's that unsurpassing knowledge that Paul is praying that we can know that unsurpassing knowledge. And I'm like, all right, I think it's
Right,
beyond my
right,
comprehension, though.
right.
I am challenged and humbled by that.
There is a knowing in the realization that God is beyond categories. There is a knowing that can create a faithfulness and a foundation. And so I think that's one of these things where it's like mystery and knowledge. It's not either or, but I think grappling, as you might say, with the mystery gives us a better insight just of who we are, just how small we are, and how great God is. And that in itself is a gift from God and something to herald and preach to the nations the goodness and surpassing greatness of God. Which, if we could put it in a formula, it would be far less impressive.
We hit some deep stuff right there. Jason, I really, really appreciate it and look forward to a lot more conversations. Love having those relationships in the Northwest and making disciples with like minded
Mm-mm.
people who have a
Amen.
passion for the
Yeah, man, you too.
Northwest.
Thank
So,
you.
Jason, have a great day. Thank you. Hey family, thank you for watching this teaser video. If you'd like to listen to the entire interview, check out the podcast link in the description down below. Thank you.